Hello and welcome to another edition of Revive and Thrive. I'm your host, Joshua Blum, and today we're going to be talking about the letter H. This is a podcast for physician fathers, and I'm a psychiatrist by training. Sometimes these episodes touch on mental health topics, sometimes they don't. When we're talking about physician burnout, which is the whole point of this podcast, and little things you might be able to do to think about and work on that, the issue of time often comes up. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, because today's episode, as we're going through the alphabet, we're now on the letter H. This is our 8th podcast. And H in this case stands for hours, which is essentially about ways to think about and use it in more intentional ways. A lot of times when we think about time, I think often in medicine, things progress, at least at this point, recording this in 2023, things progress at a pace that we're not always necessarily comfortable with. Things are coming at us very, very quickly. Now, put aside medicine for a second. What about just raising children, especially small children? Their experience of time is much different than ours. Obviously, they're younger and they're smaller, but younger children, they typically get bored faster. Their attention spans are much shorter, and so they're off and running from one thing to the next to the next. And it's hard for them to settle down and just kind of do one thing for a while. And so as an adult, it may be challenging to keep up with your young children. And when they want something, they want it now. 3-year-olds are not known for their patience. I will say, many physicians are probably not necessarily known for their patience either. If you think about so many things that we have now in our world, these are inventions that were often designed to save time. But it often seems like the more time you save, the quicker the people expect answers, the quicker that they expect results. And that means that just increases the amount of things that are coming at you all at once. Pressure and time are often related. One of the things, of course, about time is that, no matter how old we are, we never really know how much more time we have. We have a certain amount of it. It's sort of the ultimate non-fungible token, I guess, if you want to think of it that way, because once a minute or a second or an hour has been spent, you can never go back and replay it in quite the same way. And 1 minute for one person is going to be entirely different from a minute for another person. It's not really exchangeable. It's unique. And it's also one of those commodities that we can never buy more of. Not really, anyway. We do things that hopefully will extend our time and maybe prevent like premature illness or premature death or whatever. But still, there's no way to kind of add on. No matter how much money you have, you can't go out and buy a few more years. The closest you can probably do is put things in place that hopefully will allow you to enjoy your time as fully as possible, however much you're given. So when we think about living intentionally, I think often and how this relates to just burnout in general, as we talked about before, the idea of being burned out, it's almost like the candle burning at both ends, right? We're being pulled in many, many different directions, and we're working hard, but yet it seems like nothing we do feels meaningful. It feels like we are essentially running on a treadmill. Nothing we really do makes a whole lot of difference. We don't seem to go anywhere, and it leads people to feel beaten down. It's tempting to then fall into a mentality of I can't do this because, one, I don't have time, or I can't do this because it doesn't matter anyway. Obviously, the whole point of this podcast series is to question that and to say, like, okay, well, are there things that you can do to change your situation even a little bit? Well, one way of making this kind of seem clear is to think about just time in a very concrete sense. So everybody knows that there's 24 hours in a day. There's 7 days in a week, which means if you multiply the two, for all you math majors, it's 168 hours that exist in a week. Now, if you look at a couple other things, now I took some of this data, and you can find statistics for anything, but I looked at some data. This is from the U.S. Department, or U.S. Bureau of Labor from 2009. So it may have changed since that's what I happen to find that, but about 8.67 hours per day spent sleeping for your average person, and 1.22 hours per day spent eating. Many people sleep less than that. Some people may eat more or less than that, but this is just sort of an average. If you do the math there, you'll come to about 70 hours, 69.23 hours per week spent just on sleeping, just on eating. People often say, well, you sleep about a third of your life. You may sleep a little bit less than that if you're a doctor, because you may in fact sleep less. So yeah, these are rough estimates. I looked at the AMA for some data on how much your average physician tends to work. In the past, I've seen them broken up by specialty. If you go to the AMA, if you just Google like AMA work hours for average physician or something like that, you will see that at least this was, when was this? This was, I think, relatively recent. No, not that recent. Actually, 2014. They did a work-life profile of today's physician. This is 9 years out of date. But at the time, the majority of physicians in their survey worked between 40 and 60 hours per week. About 62%. So let's split the difference and make it 50 hours per week. So just as this on average to make the math easy. So if we subtract, to see what's left over, right? If there's 168 hours in a week, take out 50 for working, take out 69.23 or about 70 for eating and sleeping, you will actually get 48.77 or about 50 hours per week. That's not for working, not for sleeping, not for eating. Which is interesting, right? I mean, that's actually kind of a lot. That's a whole nother work week, basically, that you could spend doing something else. Now, in reality, what would be filled with that? If you're a father, then you, by default, have some children. Now, you may not necessarily be doing childcare stuff all the time. It's interesting. What would you do with that extra 50 hours? Well, it's a 50 hours that you may, in fact, already have. So when we say, I don't have enough time, if you think about, that's a very common expression a lot of people use. I don't have time for that. But do you really? When we think about this topic, ultimately, we make time for what's important to us. So if you didn't have time for it, if it didn't get done, chances are it wasn't that important. I would say, particularly for many folks in very busy professional careers, give yourself a break, because chances are you are doing the best you can. And so if it didn't get done, if you didn't have time for it, chances are it really wasn't that important at that particular moment. Now, in an absolute sense, maybe it is important long term, but it didn't get done today. Well, chances are it probably will get done tomorrow or someday in the future. When we think about time, we obviously can't do everything all at once. In order for us to get anything done at all, we have to kind of think about it in a hierarchical way to say, like, okay, this is the sort of mission priority thing that needs to be done now, and the next thing, and the next thing after that. When we get overwhelmed, and this is, again, one of those things when so many things are coming at us at the same time, that hierarchical ability, the ability to create a stepwise plan kind of goes away. We go into kind of fight or flight mode, and then everything, it's like a flat plane. Everything is of equal importance because we lose the ability to do that kind of executive functioning in terms of planning. And so taking a step back and saying, like, okay, really, what is the most important thing that needs to be done? What is the mission critical thing that has to be done right now? Sometimes will help us regroup and come to terms with what is actually important for the moment. If you find yourself saying, like, I don't have time for this, what you might actually be meaning is, I don't have time for it right now, but here's what I'm going to make time for it later. So it's a constant juggling act, I think, of how you want to use those free hours. In this case, using this math, 50 hours. So a couple of things to think about. For that time that you have, let's just use that 50 hours in a week free, which sort of translates, about 7 hours and change per day. So, 7 hours or so when you're not eating, you're not working, you're not sleeping, that you could use for other things. So what's important to do during that time? What would you like to accomplish in your non-working, non-sleeping, not eating time? Maybe hobbies, travel, things on your bucket list. Maybe it's time with family and friends. This is probably worth its own thing. Sometimes family and friends can seem like an obligation in some cases, especially if it's not particularly positive. But the idea is that how much of a role do you want any of these one things to play in your non-work time? Sometimes you don't have a choice about it. If you're a father, that comes with some certain obligations. And the younger your children are, the more time that will be spent just with basic survival sort of things. One way to think about it is that let's just take that 7 hours per day or the 50 hours per week and parse it out. How much time goes to these different things? How much time would you like to save? Maybe it's only an hour a week for something else that you're not able to do. One other thing to think about is that, how much time do you spend doing other stuff that feels meaningless to you? Maybe it's a commute. Is there a way to take that commute and make it more meaningful? You don't have the ability to move, which is not necessarily realistic to everybody. Could you do something else at the same time? You could listen to something. Maybe it's music. Maybe it's a podcast. Maybe it's learning another language while you're commuting. Whatever. Something to make that time a little bit better so it doesn't feel like you're wasting it. Trying to get through to the next step. We spent years as physicians working towards the next step, the next step, the next step. Well, at some point you got to live your life. And that time for many of you who are, say, attending is now. So if you spend all the time up to now just sort of working for the next thing, then what's the thing after this? Retirement? Death? Just to put things in perspective. If you ever seen the movie Office Space, if you haven't, I totally recommend seeing it. It's hilarious. Although it's a comedy, it's all about this in a way. It's about a guy named Peter who's working in a dead-end software job, and he hates it. And so it's all about, in comic kind of terms, it's about what do you want to do with your time? Is there something better that you could be doing with it that is more meaningful? Again, it gets back to the idea of personal meaning. And one of the things that's central about just burnout in general is that when people can take vacation, they can do more yoga classes, they can whatever, but until that actual work time itself is and becomes more meaningful, then the burnout part is not going to go away. So there has to be something that makes that time not just tolerable, but it has personal meaning to you. And trying to figure out how you use your time. Now, we talked mostly about how to use your non-work time, but you could do this exact same exercise in figuring how you actually parse out your work day. Because chances are there's a lot of meaningless time that gets spent with other stuff that really does not contribute to your well-being in the slightest. Meetings and other kinds of stuff like that you sort of have to do, but you're not really present for. You're trying to do some other work or whatever, or it's something that just eats up hours, and part of you is just wishing you could do something else. There's probably many, many of those things, not all of which you have control over. But imagine if you did have control over it, how would you change it, right? I'm going to leave you with a quote. This is on the actor Brandon Lee's tombstone. It's from a novel by an author named Paul Bowles called The Sheltering Sky. It was taken from an interview that I think shortly before his death and put on his tombstone. And it fits with this particular episode. And it goes, because we don't know when we will die, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. Yet everything happens only a certain number of times, and a very small number, really. How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood? Some afternoon that is so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it? Perhaps 4, 5 times more, perhaps not even that. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20, and yet it all seems limitless. We never know how much time we're going to have, as I mentioned before. And the real purpose, I think, of this particular episode is to, I think, not only just remind people of that, we all kind of know that inherently. It's not always a pleasant thing to think about, but also just to think about how you want to use it. So use that time well, or at least use it to do the things that you would like to do. And so with that, I'm going to sign off. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you guys next time.